Hello everyone, and welcome to this module of our training series where we'll talk about the plumbing connections when using the Trinity Lx as a boiler. The plumbing for using the appliance as a water heater is quite different and is covered in a different segment. For new installations, it's important to flush the entire system prior to connecting plumbing to the boiler to make sure it's free of sediment, flux, solder, scale, debris, etc., things that can be harmful to the system and the boiler. During the assembly of the heating system, it's important to keep the inside of the piping free of any debris including construction and copper dust, sand, dirt, etc. For retrofits, all system piping including radiators must be cleansed of all buildup of sludge and scale. So all systems, old and new, need to be cleansed to remove flux, grease, and carbon residue. NTI recommends cleansing the boiler system with Fernox F3 cleaner. For retrofit applications with heavy limescale and sludge deposits, you may need a heavier duty cleaner. It's important to properly cleanse the system because failure to get rid of the heating system contaminants may void your NTI warranty and could result in premature heat exchanger failure and/or property damage. Hot water boilers such as the Trinity Lx are designed to operate with airless water in the system, so an air elimination device of some sort needs to be installed in the system to remove air from the water as it circulates through. It's recommended to include an air eliminator on the secondary system as well. Now 30 psi relief valve is included with each boiler, but most models are rated to either 145 or 160 psi, except for the LX150 in Canada. You can check the rating plate on the heat exchanger to determine the exact rating of the model you are working with, but in instances where the heat exchanger is rated to 145 psi or higher, a higher psi relief valve can be used instead of the 30 psi version included with the boiler. When installing the Trinity Lx boiler, you need to consider the condition of the water in the heating system. The hardness should be somewhere between 3 and 9 grains per gallon, and the pH should be between 7.5 and 9.5. Boiler water that falls outside of those conditions needs to be treated with a corrosion inhibitor, but there really is no downside to treating the water even when it falls within those ranges. Each Trinity Lx boiler is provided with at least one bottle of Fernox F1 corrosion inhibitor. The LX 800 comes with 2 bottles, the rest of the boilers come with 1. A bottle is enough to treat a 26.4 gallon or 100 liter heating system to a minimum required concentration of 0.5%. Systems with greater volume will require more inhibitor. For more information on performing the treatment, follow the instructions with the Fernox F1 protector. To maintain the protection, the level of corrosion inhibitor should be monitored periodically to ensure the correct concentration, and there are Fernox test strips available that can be used to test the boiler water to make sure the level of inhibitor concentration is sufficient. For systems requiring freeze protection, you should only use inhibited propylene glycol, specially formulated for hydronic heating systems. Don't use other types of antifreeze as they may be harmful to the system. And it's important to remember that using glycol could reduce the usable output capacity of the boiler, requiring the unit to be downfired by limiting the maximum operating capacity and/or the maximum water temperature. NTI recommends against exceeding 35% concentration of glycol. When looking at the near boiler plumbing, let's start with the pressure relief valve. A 30 psi pressure relief valve is factory supplied with all Trinity Lx boilers. Models that are dual certified as either boilers or water heaters also include an additional higher pressure relief valve of either 125 psi or 150 psi depending on the model. Excluding LX150s that are sold in Canada, Trinity Lx boilers have a maximum allowable operating pressure of either 145 psi or 160 psi depending on the model. So a pressure relief valve with a higher discharge pressure rating than the 30 psi one included with the boiler may be used as long as the relieving capacity is in excess of the maximum input capacity of the boiler. The pressure relief valve needs to be installed at the boiler outlet and in the vertical position as shown on this slide, with the drain pipe outlet exiting the side of the pressure relief valve horizontally and elbowing down. If using a higher pressure relief valve such as a 125 psi, ensure the pressure gauge is sized to display the higher pressure value, for example, in that case a 160 psi pressure gauge. If the relief valve is installed with the incorrect orientation, for example horizontally with the drain pipe out of the bottom, it may not function properly, resulting in property damage or personal injury. Ensure the discharge of the pressure relief is piped to a location where the steam or water will not cause property damage or serious injury. All Trinity Lx models also come factory supplied with a pressure gauge. Models that are dual certified as either boiler or water heater also have an additional factory supplied pressure gauge at a higher PSI rating. For boiler installations, either the lower or higher pressure gauge may be used. The pressure gauge must be installed at the appliance's outlet prior to any circulators and in the general vicinity of the pressure relief valve. The Trinity Lx boiler uses a low mass heat exchanger that requires a minimum rate of forced water circulation anytime the burner is operating. In order to make sure the minimum flow rate is attained at all times, the boiler needs to be installed in a primary-secondary plumbing configuration using closely spaced T's to decouple the boiler loop or primary loop from the system loop or secondary loops. You'll see examples of the primary-secondary loop configurations in Part 2 of this segment on boiler plumbing. Due to the design of the LX, it's more restrictive than conventional boilers, and there can be a tendency to underestimate the size of the pump required on the primary loop and for domestic hot water. We lay out in the manual the minimum pump sizes required for each model. It indicates a specific pump across 4 different pump manufacturers for each LX model. These are the minimum size pumps that should be used for each the primary pump and the domestic hot water pump when using the boiler with an indirect. The chart also shows the minimum flow rate for the primary loop, the restriction head loss for the boiler itself, and the recommended size pipe to be used for the primary loop. There are also a couple of things to keep in mind when using glycol. Ideally, you shouldn't exceed 30 to 35% glycol in the system, and never more than 50%. If you are using a glycol that has the built-in inhibitor, as most of them do, then don't use the inhibitor that we include with the boiler. When external safety devices are being used, such as a low water cutoff, flow switch, or a temperature limiting switch, they can be wired directly into the low voltage terminal strip. We'll cover that in the wiring section of the training. The Trinity Lx 800 comes equipped with a factory installed flow switch installed in a 2-inch diameter line. The flow switch is pre-plumbed with a NEMA 4 rated enclosure and pre-wired via liquid tight conduit. According to ASME CSD1, a flow switch must be used in lieu of a low water cutoff for a water tube boiler. And that concludes this first section on LX boiler plumbing. Look for Part 2 on boiler plumbing, where we'll take a look at some piping diagrams.